Welcome this morning to Sunday School on this April 11th, 2021 here at Cliffview Chapel Baptist Church, Kanab, Utah. This is the place, this is the time. And our next goal is heaven. But in between now and then, we'll just keep busy serving the Lord, right? I mean, because, after this place, there's no better place than heaven. Everything else from here is a step down and away. So we are so glad you're here this morning. Next Sunday, we're going to say a sad goodbye to Chris and Patty. It's their last Sunday before they head to their next work assignment. So we're looking forward to having just a little more time with them. It's good to have Stacy back with us this morning. It's always good to see. I think that now we're kind of officially over it, right? To the next variant. So let's go to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6. We are looking at the seal judgments. Remember, there are 3 sets of 7. And if we were to name them off, it'd be seal, trumpet, and vial. The first set, the first 6 judgments, first 6 seals take place, and then the 7th announces the first trumpet judgment. You have 6 trumpet judgments, and the 7th trumpet judgment announces the vial judgments, and there's 7 of those, which are more toward the last half, or the second half of the tribulation. Now, let's just kind of go through the big picture. What's the next event on God's prophetic calendar? It's the rapture. It's a signless, imminent event, meaning that there's nothing that's a certain sign to tell when it is, but it's imminent that it could happen in a moment. Then after the rapture starts the 7-year tribulation period. 7 years, we believers are in heaven. The dead in Christ has risen first, and we join them to meet the Lord in the air and forever be with him. We're in heaven. On earth, horrible things start to happen. A little slow at first, and it picks up steam. After 7-year tribulation is the second coming of Christ. Properly, that is really the second coming of Christ. Although sometimes the whole scheme is called the second coming of Christ. That's when he'll physically come back to earth with us, engage in the battle of Armageddon, put down the enemy. The devil will be put into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years. Jesus will usher in or bring in the big M. Millennium, meaning 1,000. Bring a 1,000-year reign on earth. At the end of the 1,000 years, what happens? The devil's let out of the bottomless pit for a short season to try one more coup. He's put down with the power of Christ's voice, and then he's cast along with the great white throne judgment. He's cast into the lake of fire, and that's a one-way trip forever. And then the new heaven and the new earth comes about, and that's what we enjoy for the rest of eternity. It's almost like an oxymoron, the rest of eternity, because the rest sounds like you go and then you stop, the rest of it, but eternity doesn't have a rest. It just goes on, doesn't it? So we are on the seal judgments. We're on the 6th seal. We looked at the first 5. The first one was what? Basically the introduction or the emerging of the Antichrist. The second seal, a rider on a red horse, was war and bloodshed. The third seal, the rider on the black horse, was famine and all that comes from that. The fourth seal was the pale horse, and that was bringing about what? Death of 1/4 of the world's population. If the world's population is at that point what it is now, it would be about 2 billion people, almost 2 billion people would die. So the 5th seal is what? Now, Right, and that's more of a scene in heaven. The first four are scenes on earth. The martyrs, when they cry for what? For God to avenge their blood, huh? And he doesn't rebuke them for wanting that, but rather he says, just be patient. There are more people that are going to die, and we'll avenge all their blood. So now we go to the sixth seal. This is verse 12 of chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 12. And I beheld, and he that opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood, and the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs, when she is shaken of a mighty wind. And the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. And every mountain and island were moved out of their places. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountain, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand it? So this is a different kind of judgment than the previous ones. The previous ones, up to this point, most of the troubles came because of the result of the actions of men. You know, war and famine and death and so forth. This one, and by the way, they all came by divine permission, those previous judgments and the calamity from it. But this one, we see the beginning of God's direct anger, that he's not allowing men to be the giver of that anger, but him himself. This is a catastrophic terrestrial and celestial judgment. It's going to be an earth-shaking earthquake. It says in verse 12, a great earthquake. And then the result is that it's going to have, the sun is going to blacken, the moon is going to turn to a red blood, and then there's going to be stellar showers, meteorites, stars, and so forth. Every section of the earth will be jolted and moved by this killer quake. History tells us in 1883, August 27th, 1883, Krakatoa, a volcano, Krakatoa, let go, and it was the loudest noise ever made on earth. It's estimated that a cubic mile of rock entered the atmosphere, and dust and debris circled the earth to a height of 17 miles. And for 2 years, strange red sunsets were seen. In fact, I was before I was studying up to this point, I watched a video maybe a month ago. It's one of these curiosity type videos, and it was about why there was a change in sunsets and sunrises, and it referred back to this volcano. So that was a sample of what would happen. Of course, that was more regional. Imagine an earthquake that affects the whole earth like that. And so we can see in verse number 12 that the sun become black as sackcloth because of the debris that results from it, and the moon become as blood. And like those red sunsets, that's going to affect how we see the moon. That's what happens to the earth. In fact, it says in verse 13 that the stars of heaven, so not only is it an earth thing, but it's a terrestrial thing, where the stars of heaven, we could see within that meteorites and other heavenly debris would fall upon the earth. And it says, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs. In other words, it's not ready for them to fall, but the wind is so fierce that it causes them to fall. So it doesn't take much imagination for us to understand how catastrophic this will be. Not localized, not something that seems to be short-lived, especially the effects of it. But then we go to verse 14, 15, 16 and on, and we see that the reaction to the people on earth to this. And this is kind of an interesting thing we see here. Number one, we're going to see this panic and fear. Verse 14, and the heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. So it's going to be quite the show, huh? It's going to be a whole environmental difference that people are not going to see. It's not going to be the same every day that we see. Hey, it's predictable. It's going to be very unpredictable. And it talks about it's going to affect the mountains and the islands. So the lay of the land is going to be rearranged. And, obviously earthquakes bring tsunamis quite often. So we could see how it would affect the islands being moved out of place. What was a nice Caribbean island that people lived on? Guam, for instance. We have the Roselles and Linda and Bonnie have a brother and a son and a nephew in Guam. Imagine that not being anything, or maybe just entirely not there at all on it. And so the reaction is what here? Well, it's really one of, it affects every class of people. Notice how verse 15 says this. There's no class distinction. All that is bridged. It says that the kings of the earth, it affects them, the great men, the mighty men, the chief men. It goes right on down to the bondman. Now that would be, in their culture, a person who is a servant. No one is excluded from this. In fact, there are 2 chapters in the New Testament that Jesus in his Gospels left us, things he talked about, that kind of give us a gospel parallel to the tribulation. One is Matthew chapter 24. The other is Luke chapter 21. Look at Luke 21. Now, don't lose Revelation. But if you would, hold there and go to Luke 21. Now, sometimes we're desensitized by all the stuff we see on movies and whatnot, the explosions, and we think, well, those are pretty mighty, and it's going to be like that. It's going to be more than we could have ever imagined. Luke 21, and you'll notice in verse 26. Now, this is 21, basically is a shorter synopsis of Matthew 24. That tells the things that are going to happen, some of them during the tribulation period. And in verse number 25 of Luke 21, it says, and there shall be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars. Now what is that? Well, we were reading about those, weren't we? And upon the earth, distress of nations, meaning kings, obviously, is affected, in kingdoms, with perplexity. The sea and the waves roaring. Verse 26, men's hearts failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. I mean, they just have never experienced this kind of thing. This great fear grips them. You're talking about fear that we've had this past year. A lot of people have had nothing like what they see. Because this is not where you can go anywhere to escape. They're trying to, aren't they? Back in Revelation 6, they, in the end of verse 15, they try to hide themselves in dens and in the rocks of the mountain. Why? Because of this atmospheric type thing, these things that are falling. I mean, you don't know where to go. I mean, you say, well, I'll stay in my home. Well, one of those things come through. I remember, a dozen years ago, over in Rockville, or maybe Springdale, toward the entrance, there was a little house there. People were sleeping in it, and one of those rocks about the size of a small bus up on the cliff they lived below let go, and that rolled down and hit and killed both of them. I think they were still in bed. I don't know, what was that, 10 years ago maybe, so, or give or take a while ago. And so, everybody's going, oh, that's so horrible. They were not protected, no matter what you have there. They weren't protected. So people think, well, if I can get in the dens and the rocks of the mountains, but silly them, because it talks about the mountains and the islands being moved out of their place. There's no escaping of it. So there's no safety net. No getting away from it there. And so you can see that the response you think would be, okay, God, you win. We'll listen to you. Let's see if it is. Verse 16. And they said to the mountains and the rocks. So instead of addressing God, chapter 6 of Revelation, I'm sorry, back there, yeah, and verse number 16, instead of crying out to God, they're asking the rocks, hey, nature, would you help us? Would you take care of us? There's a big thing toward people talking about nature being a god, and they're going to turn and say, fall on us and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Now, instead of thinking, well, I'm going to die because of what God is doing, they want to, hey, just kill me so I don't have to face God. And notice, they attribute it to God. They're not saying, well, this is just some phenomenon from nature. At that point, at least, they're understanding that this is from God, and it is because who's mad? It's the wrath of the Lamb. Now, who's the Lamb? Jesus. Now, that's sure a contrasting picture to what we see in some of the New Testament Gospels. Not that it was another Jesus, but it's a different time. The first time he came to seek and save those who are lost. The second time he's coming with the judgment for those who were lost and didn't take an opportunity of his grace. Now, in the next chapter, there is a measure of grace shown because we'll see some people getting saved that maybe perhaps didn't have an opportunity and didn't reject the truth before Christ came. They're living on earth, and they didn't reject the truth. They just didn't know it, and there's an opportunity to be witness to know that. So notice in verse number 17, for the great day of, and they're still saying this, aren't they? For the great day of his wrath is come. They recognize. And it seems to be that they knew about this scheme of things, because they're calling it, the day of his wrath. It's not like they're looking around trying to discern it, like, we knew this, and we still didn't do anything about it. And it finishes with, and who shall be able to stand it? So they admit, we're defeated. We can't get around this. We can't send a missile to space to break up the asteroids, and maybe they won't have the great impact of Earth. Number one, they're down to 3/4 of the population. And it seems to be that 2 billion people that will be wiped out will be across all sectors. So some of the brain trust, some of the people that could help fight back against this are probably not with them anyhow, huh? Now we move to chapter 7. I want to show you, I don't know, do you still have this chart here? Have it handy? Okay. If not, you can just browse on. Chapter 7. Remember, I said that there are some parenthetical chapters in Revelation. What that means is these are chapters that don't advance the narrative or the timeline as such. It's telling us what actions are going to happen, but rather it explains the narrative. And if you'll look, let's see if I can get this. I'm doing this from here. So we are at the end of chapter 6. So you can see the 6 judgments up here, 1 through 6. These are the seal judgments. Remember, this is the seal that was in chapter 4 and 5. Who can open the seal? These are the 7 seals, representative now. And Jesus comes along and opens them. As he opens each of these things happen. You see the horses, the martyrs, and then divine wrath. Now, it's called divine wrath because that wrath is obviously credited to God. Chapter 6. Now we go into a parenthetical chapter, chapter 7. Now, as we move along this timeline, we'll go to chapters 8 and 9, which are the trumpet judgments. You can see there's 6 of them because the 7th seal introduces these, and the 7th trumpet judgment introduces the vial judgments there. So there's another parenthesis in chapters 10 and 11, and then you have chapters 12 and 13, the beginning of the trumpet judgments, and then you have chapter 14 and 15. They're not parenthetical chapters as such, but they're like a preview. Chapter 14 is a preview of what has happened, and chapter 15 is a prelude of what is about to happen with all these trumpet judgments, or bowl judgments that are happening. So we're looking at 7 right now, so you can see those. Chapter 7 and chapter 10 and 11 And then chapter 14 and 15 is a preview of the final events. Now there's a little bit of in chapter 16, there's a little bit of a parenthetical for a few verses that looks back, because that's when the trumpet judgments really start. So let's look at chapter 7, if you would. Turn this off so I don't blind you. Chapter 7. This is often called a parenthesis of mercy. So the narrative stops, and it shows that God is going to extend some mercy. This explains how this is going to happen. It's sort of like a suspension of judgment for a bit. The first 3 verses. Chapter 7. And after these things I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. Now that's in contrast to the fig tree that shakes so violently in the previous chapter, huh? And I saw another angel, so there was 4, now that you got to see the 5th angel, ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea. Now, why does that play in here? Because the trumpet judgment, how does it come about? Who blows the trumpets? Angels. So they're the ones that will be able to blow these trumpets to instigate the continuing wrath on earth. But for a bit, the 5th angel here, we call that the sealing angel, because he has the sealing from God, the seal of the living God. He cries and says in verse 3, saying, "Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." Now, isn't that interesting? If we were to skip ahead, there'll be a time where people will be required to take what's called the mark of the beast, often associated with 666. I don't know if you remember, there used to be a road in the edge of New Mexico, Route 666, and after a number of years, they changed that. Because did it go through Arizona too? Yeah? See, you guys have all that stuff down there. Yeah. All we have is Moroni and Mordecai and all these weird names like Moab. Who would name their town Moab? Never thought that one out. But here, these are servants of God that will be sealed in their foreheads. So that's symbolic of their mind, of their identity, is all under the protection and control of God. So the ministry of these angels and other angels is pretty predominant in the book of Revelation. For instance, angels minister in chapter 5, chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 10, chapter 14, 16, 18, and 19. All the involvement of angels. Because what is an angel? What is the most simplest biblical definition of an angel? Sure. He's answering it with the negative. Not me, he said. I mean, not him. Hold spot. What's that? Well, you're right there on target. Let's go to Hebrews. Don't lose your spot again. And we'll give this to you, so it'll be handy for later on. Hebrews 1. Hebrews 1. Someone said that they knew that their wife was an angel because she was always up in the air harping about something. That's horrible. I don't know. Yes, I don't know. That guy's horrible. Is he still alive? Rumor has it that she had a rolling pin. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 7. Now this is, remember, Hebrews is the writer talking about how much better Jesus was than any of their old Judaism. And they seem to have slowed down in coming to Christ, and he wants to keep them going on the path to Christ. So he's telling them that Jesus is better than the angel. Look at verse 4. Jesus being made so much better than the angels. Verse 7. And the angel saith, who maketh his angels, what's the word? Spirits. And his ministers a flame of fire. Now look at verse 14 for even greater clarity. Are not they, the they is the angels, are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to minister for them who shall be the heirs of salvation? Who's the heirs of salvation? Yeah, the recipients of salvation, heirs. And they're sent forth to minister. God uses them to minister for us on his behalf. They're ministering spirits. Now, sometimes those angels, and a spirit is incorporeal. You can't see it. You can't touch it. It's not a material substance, but obviously it has force in the sense that it could cause, you might feel the wind that it might make or hear the voice that it may give. But sometimes it's shown in a human form. God has it shown throughout Scripture. At certain times they show up in temporary human form. And by the way, they're always in the male gender. Of course, people say, well, do we really know what that is nowadays? The male, the female? We do. They're in the male gender. So therefore, if we're going to put an angel on a tree during some holiday, my little plug, on the top of the tree, and you're going to make it take a form, make sure it's male. I'm tired of seeing these women angels on the tree. It's just so ungodly. That's so wrong. Little editorial comment. So they are ministering spirits, okay? Let's just remember, keep that. That's the core definition. They are spirits that God has sent to minister on his behalf to who? To the heirs of salvation. Now let's go back to our text in Revelation here. So we learned a lot of things. They're a spirit, and when they appear in a human form, they appear as a man. Just want to say that one more time. Now, in the eschatology is a fancy word for a study of the end times, the whole theology. In eschatology, angels are involved, active in the affairs of nations. We'll not take time to go back there, but in Daniel chapter 10, the angels were active in the affairs of Persia. In chapter 11, with the Medes. In chapter 12, with Israel. So God quite often uses them for that. But notice these angels. What were they angels of? Verse 1 of chapter 7, standing where? Four corners of the earth. Now, four corners of the earth, that's a symbolic way of representing that they encompass the whole earth. In other words, from east is to west and north is to south, and so to speak. They were all encompassing the whole earth, these four angels, their power. And then notice that they were holding what? The four winds. And by looking at other scripture, like in Job, for instance, Isaiah, Jeremiah, we can see that quite often wind was a sign of judgment. Remember with Job, the whirlwind came and wiped out all of his stuff and killed his kids. It was a sign of judgment. So these angels are holding the judgment. Now, think about this. If these are, in fact, the trumpet judgments, they're holding the judgment, which is symbolized by wind. What causes a trumpet to sound? Wind, your breath, right? And so the fifth angel comes and says and cries out. This is the angel having the seal of the Lord. He comes from the east. It reminds us of Psalms 91:11, where it says, "And he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee in all thy ways." Now, we get just a few minutes, so maybe we'll just dwell on this for a bit before we go on to the narrative. People often ask the question, do we have guardian angels? Well, the Bible doesn't necessarily use the terminology that way. It does imply some things that we could at least draw some conclusions from. Can't be real fanatic. For instance, when the children come to Jesus and the disciples said, "Oh, he doesn't have time, get away." And he said, no, forbid them not to come. He says, "For their angel, the children's angel, doth always behold the face of the Father." Seeming to say that these children have guardian angels, an angel that's assigned to them. Because some of you said, "I don't know how I made it out of childhood all in one piece." There wasn't soft stuff on the playground, no chain on your bike, guard on your bike chain or anything, and you didn't die, and you ate dirt, and Now, it talks here about, in the psalm, "For he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee." So whether it's one angel to one person, or whether it's angels that come at certain times when we need to be kept. We can't be real emphatic. But remember in Acts chapter 12, you say, I don't remember Acts chapter 12. See, that's why you come at Bible study. We've been going through that. Acts chapter 12, Peter was in jail, and the church meets in Mary's house, and they're praying because the gospel's at risk, at stake there, and they're praying that God would intervene, and Peter gets out. An earthquake happens, and he get out, right? And where does Peter come? He comes back to where he knows the church is meeting. So what's that tell us? If you ever go to jail, and when you get out, get back here. We'll be waiting for you. Well, as long as you're in there for the right stuff. And when he comes back, he knocks on the gate, and a damsel comes, and she sees and hears, but she can't believe it's him. So she hurries back in and says, they say she's crazy. They say, no, I heard, and so forth. And they said, maybe it is his angel. Now, that doesn't mean that's what we believe. That means that's what they were believing at their time, that perhaps that Peter's guardian angel came to represent him there. And they eventually found out that it wasn't just his angel, it was Peter. And they opened the gate. So, angels, we did a series on that a year or two or three or four ago, and we learned a lot, only what the Bible can tell us. But at least know that however that works, whether it's a one-to-one or whatnot, you're not alone, not by yourself. His angels are in charge over you. And don't let It's a Wonderful Life and Jimmy Stewart teach you your theology of angels. That every time a bell rings, they get their wings. That's sad to say. Remember the whole thing with angels back, touched by an angel, all these angels about 20 years ago? A lot of people got into that. And almost to the point where they almost wanted to worship them in a sense. But remember, in the end, when John sees and falls at the angel and goes to worship him, and John should have known better. Here's a man old in the faith, written the book of Revelation. What does the angel do? He rebukes him and says, worship me not, worship God. And angels are spirits, but they're not the spirit of the living God. Let's finish in prayer. Father, thank you for this day and all that we can learn. Father, we admit that it's fascinating because it's about our future, but Father, help us to move it beyond just the mere novelty of it, to be our theology, to be what prepares our hearts and minds for what's ahead, that gives us peace, Father, to know that you're in charge. It's all your play. And yet, Father, an urgency to reach those who don't know you. We pray this always